About 3,000 of you subscribe, but only about 200 are getting notifications, so click the bell and click all. There's quite a lot of people, cottage industry even, of people who make a living or something of a living writing books about online culture and various aspects, usually to demonize and hate upon it. And usually they're written by people who don't understand, aren't a part of, can't authoritatively commentate on these online areas that they're talking about. Angela Nagel's Kill All Normies was a pleasant surprise because it wasn't entirely like that. It still got a lot of things wrong. And like a lot of people, I don't think she really understands or detects irony properly. But we're not talking about Kill All Normies today. Laura Bates, author and Barbie doll you left in your car on a hot summer's day, she's written a book called Men Who Hate Women, which is ostensibly about the Manosphere. Now, I wouldn't say I'm part of the men's rights movement. I would say I'm an egalitarian, but with a particular interest in men's issues. But still, I have been adjacent to, maybe a part of. I've observed this community. I know what the terminology means. I know some of these people, by and large, good people, just out for equality, which is what we should all desire, right? And which is a left-wing value, fundamentally. But if you go by what Laura Bates has written, the entire manosphere is made up of misogynists. Men who hate women, hence the title of the book. But that's just not true. I mean, she goes through all the typical things that one might expect. So Elliot Rodger gets a mention, even though he was not any part of any aspect of any of the men's rights movement groups or anything similar. And yet, of course, he gets invoked, and others do. It's just dishonest. So as someone who has seen this, and who does have reservations about it, and who doesn't consider himself a men's rights activist or part of the manosphere, really, I think it falls to me to observe and record for some people who might not otherwise notice just how wrong she is. It also seems to tie in a, and I hesitate to say it, in a dog whistly type way to some of the more turf opinions that you find in The Guardian. So it opens this review in The Guardian by Stephen Paul, a man who looks like a finger puppet. We've drawn a face on your finger. So he opens up with what feels like a turf statement. Some men have for years been trying to deny women the right to their own safe spaces. Doesn't that sound like the panic over trans people invading feminist spaces, women's spaces? It certainly does to me. He talks about the old mythopoetic men's rights movement and contrasts it with the current men's rights movement. The thing is, that old movement was more an aspect of feminism, trying to feminize men, whereas the newer men's rights movement is actually concerned with rights, and men being men in whatever way they want to be. Now, it is true that there have been flirtations with the right wing, but this is because this is where traction has been gotten, where a chance to get some sort of political and social change has occurred. It's not because the values or beliefs of egalitarianism, equality before the law, and all of those things, it's not that these are right-wing values, it's just that, at least when it comes to men, it only seems to be on the right that there's any traction. I mean, here in the UK, one need only look to the women's group in Parliament and how they've attempted to disrupt International Men's Day debates and discussions and other problems. it becomes obvious that there is a really deep issue, and unfortunately it seems that many of these illiberal, anti-male, one might even say misandrist viewpoints have really taken root in the left. So instead of fighting now for equality and fairness for the genders, rather there seems to be a push for special exceptions, even supremacy for women's issues. We'll get to some specific examples a bit later on. But the men's rights movement is not innately or necessarily anti-feminist. Even those who describe themselves as anti-feminist, in the majority, it's the overreach, it's the excess, it's where feminism becomes anti-male that they would describe themselves as anti-feminist. But they're not anti-egalitarianism. So if you take an egalitarian view of feminism, then men's rights groups are feminist, except they wouldn't describe themselves that way because feminism has changed so much. He poo-poos in his review, and the book poo-poos, the idea that there is discrimination against men in terms of university assistance, particularly in the States, or funding for domestic violence shelters, saying that that's biased, or demanding that men be allowed entrance into women's spaces, like as he mentions in the beginning, but in an inverse of the way in which women have demanded access into men's spaces. Yeah, equality has to cut both ways here. But the trouble is that he not only, in his review, mischaracterizes the men's rights movement, and the book doesn't only mischaracterize the men's rights movement, it conflates the entire manosphere into one single thing, including men's human rights, pickup artists, incels, you know how it goes. There are extremes in all of these communities, just as you'll find extremes in their corollary on the other side. For every incel, there's a bitter old spinster. For every men's rights activist who is angry because of bad treatment by women, you will find an equally radical feminist, unhinged, perhaps by bad treatment from men. One need only look at the TERFs to see just how hatred of men, it can really, really twist someone's thinking. Pickup artists is a little bit different, but you will find bad advice for women for dating as well. But the Manosphere is more than any of these. Sites like the Good Men Project, which is a rather feminist men's website, that would fall into the Manosphere. It's just absurd to only take the most extreme examples to give them the worst possible spin and then to use that taint on the entire rest of the arena, as it would be insane to just take the Scum Manifesto and apply that to, say, a knitting group for women online. It's just as absurd, but people are so afraid and know so little about it, even apparently the people writing books or book reviews. It's easy to see how people get panicked. Men going their own way also gets mentioned. This is just men leading separate lives, as women have also done politically in the past. It's where political lesbianism comes from. So the panic and fear doesn't seem to make sense if you accept it on one side, that you decry it on the other. And of course there's the aspect to all this that Bates brings up, is this idea of radicalization, that people are being radicalized by these groups rather than that people are falling into these groups because they're failing in society, or society is not helping them, is not treating them fairly and equally. And when you're not treated fairly and equally by society, you act out, whether it's riots, protests, big social movements like the suffragettes, there's an issue here that needs to be addressed, and merely telling people that they don't have an issue isn't going to fix it. You have to address the issue, even if you have to explain why the issue is not necessarily what people think it is, if that's what you believe, but you also have to prove it. So the Manosphere is just the entire sort of male-oriented space online, right? That can include all manner of things, anything, everything that's just more male-oriented. So it's just absurd to conflate that with all this other stuff. So I want to move on a little bit. The mere mention of men's rights sends a lot of people into a tizzy, but I want to bring up just a couple of things that are real, genuine issues. Mental health is especially bad for men, and just whining about toxic masculinity doesn't fix that. Men require a different approach when it comes to mental health assistance. Not all of them, but enough of them. This is a topic close to my heart. Men commit suicide at a rate much, much higher than women, massively higher than women. And yet, there's barely any additional assistance there. In fact, a more recent slight uptick in the amount of women, so a narrowing in the proportions, caused a massive outcry and additional help for women, but the much larger rate of suicide for men has attracted very little help, lip service, if anything. Circumcision. When it comes to the circumcision of women, and they're not all as severe as each other, the lowest grade form of female circumcision is roughly analogous to standard male circumcision. Women get protected, men don't. Homelessness. There was a big headline not so long ago, 1 in 4 homeless are women, ! Glossing over the fact that, 3 out of the 4 were men, and were clearly much more affected. The groups that are failing the worst in schools are boys. Primarily white working class boys here in the UK. And yet suggest that they might need some extra help. And you'll get your head bitten off. University admittance is continuing on a trend of becoming more and more female-oriented, but again suggests that perhaps we ought to redress the balance in the way that we have for other minorities, and men get short shrift. There are real and genuine and pressing issues facing men. The Manosphere, men's rights activists, are trying to navigate this space and trying desperately to latch onto any allies that they can find, and unfortunately many of those are on the right wing. And so to cater to that audience, to that demographic, where they can actually get some traction, I think message creep has started to move to the right. And that's why I've never really been comfortable calling myself a men's rights activist. But there are real and genuine and pressing issues, and feminism isn't equipped to handle it. Women are not equipped to understand and to deal with the problems facing men any more than feminists would admit that men were, vice versa. Or if they are, it's because of expertise, which should be valued. But we live in a society that is now ideologically opposed to treating men fairly, unfortunately, in a lot of areas, or at least, if not that, dedicated to minimizing the problems that men face. Men need to speak up about these problems, and if we've got a commitment to equality, it has to cut both ways. Whether we're talking about sex, gender presentation, race, sexuality, everyone needs to be treated fairly and equitably before the law, and they're not. And many of these problems are egregious, and if you drill down to the individual issue, people will likely agree with you. But if you do it under the purview of men's rights, then you're going to have a problem. But it's clear that neither the book reviewer nor the book writer really know anything about these communities and groups upon which they're commenting. And yet they're going to be shaping the attitudes in much the same way that Gamergate was massively wrongly represented. I don't know what you do about it, because there is no way to get traction except by canting to the right, and that only entrenches the attitudes against what you're trying to do. It's a pickle. Zang. Tal, friend, and welcome to Gore. Savage and beautiful, John Norman's Gorean saga is brought to life in the Tales of Gore role-playing game and its companion world book, World of Gore. Take flight on a tarn, luxuriate in the bathhouses of Ar, pit your steel against the deadly Kuri, best your enemies and place them in your collar. Tales of Gore uses the D6 system, perfect for both new and old players. You can purchase it from Amazon, RPG Now, or Lulu.com. Ta Sada Gore!